I thought it would be interesting to examine a period of time that perhaps Jerry Only would rather forget. Doyle probably too. All of them would probably rather forget. I'm talking about, of course, there was a period of about 11 years without any activity in any sort of Misfits capacity, whether it be the 95 Misfits or the original Misfits or the Jerry Fits or the OG Fits or the 77 to 83 Fits. It was a no man's land. It was a wild, wild west of punk rock. Yeah, but in general, when I feel like punk rock has never stopped existing, but, I feel like after, 85, maybe 86, all the way up to maybe like the pop punk, third wave revival of punk, along with the third ska revival, the Epitaph, Fat Records, 90s punk renaissance that kind of really owes its due to the Descendants, who kind of pioneered that sound in the 80s. What's going on, Rue? How are you? I can actually see a comment for once. And it's during this time in history, in music history, we've talked about sort of the other things that are happening, the tape trading, Metallica's covering the Misfits. People are starting to see that skull. The skull is popping up everywhere, right? Jerry and Doyle. Well, I guess we'll go into that a little bit, and then we're going to do Little Fiend right after this. So, Jerry and Doyle are, working for their dad. I'm sure their music ambitions still exist. Jerry's Jerry's had some kids, and they're working at Pro Edge, and all is well. And people are hitting them up. This is as Jerry puts it. People are hitting them up for merch, Misfits merch, and they give out whatever they got, because Jerry's just like a gregarious guy. He's not realizing that any of this stuff is worth 100,000 times whatever it was printed on. To him, it's just stuff for the kids. For the kids, hey, doing it for the kids. The fans. Here, hey, I have the thing. Because that's just the generous nature of Jerry. And so I guess something, again, paraphrasing from my mind. This has been a while since I've reviewed this stuff, but Jerry goes over to 49 MacArthur Avenue in Lodi, where Mrs. Anzalone used to live. I don't know if the Anzalones are still in charge of that house. They go over to the house. Jerry and maybe Doyle is with them. Who knows? They go over to the house and talk to Glenn's mom, and they're like, "Hey, we want some skateboards for the kiddies," something like that. And or T-shirts, or they call up Glenn, something along those lines. It's one of those things. And Glenn's like, "Fuck off." And mind you, this is right around the time of, and again, my documentary is not going to cover this period, although it's fascinating as well. It's a far more complicated story to tell, and it's probably not. It's just too complicated, so I'm not going to get into that. Rue says the Anzalone house sold last year. That's very sad. I'm sorry to hear that. In any case, so this is around the time of 85. Caroline, I guess, starting to do deals with Glenn in the Plan 9 catalog. I don't think they've outright bought the catalog, or bought the masters, but they're putting stuff out for Glenn. So like Plan 9 is using Caroline as like a distribution network. And Glenn has just put out Legacy of Brutality, which is revered by some and hated by others, and controversial to say the least, because Legacy of Brutality has Glenn re-recording the bass and the guitar tracks himself. So it's basically Legacy of Brutality. Here's a hot take for you. Legacy of Brutality is essentially a solo Misfits album. It's Glenn basically covering all the Misfits stuff. What's going on, Russ? How are you? It's Glenn covering all the Misfits tracks. Hey, Mike, what's going up? What's going on, Mike? How you doing, man? Welcome. We're talking about Legacy of Brutality, and Legacy has all these outtakes and stuff, but Glenn re-records over the tracks because he doesn't want to pay royalties. This, of course, would start a big war, a big brouhaha between these once Italian Lodi brothers. And I don't mean Jerry and Doyle. I mean the all of them together. And it's funny, had Glenn just probably given over whatever Jerry had asked for, in probably very friendly Jerry fashion, none of this stuff would have happened. Maybe, who knows? Maybe we would have gotten a Misfits reunion in the 90s. However unlikely. But of course he didn't. And Jerry's dad was like, "What are you, fucking idiot? Like, sue this motherfucker. Like, look at all the money that's being made off of your hard work." And that began a lawsuits that lasted for years and years and years. As we know, it ends with the settlement. I think Glenn got the better deal, to be honest with you. I mean, all Jerry wanted was to write and perform under the name, which I guess is valuable in and of itself. But I think the gold is the publishing, man. The publishing and the ownership of those songs. Holy crap. What a catalog to own. And so Glenn got the publishing, and Jerry and Doyle got the rights to the name and the rights to perform. I believe Glenn had those rights too. There were a couple other cats who had those rights. I think Frank Licata, Franche Coma had those rights. I think a few other people had those rights, and Jerry bought the rights from them, bought them out of their rights to sort of consolidate his interests in performing as the Misfits. With the last party actually being Doyle. Doyle had equal right to perform as the Misfits. Like, if Jerry had just put down the bass and Doyle wanted to just go out by himself as the Misfits, I guess he legally has the right to do so. Do not quote me on that. I'm not sure, but I believe that is the case. In any case, so they're looking for the stuff. I'm getting really sidetracked. The point is that Jerry and Doyle decide to get back into music, and it's during this time that they're also doing they're doing this. I mean, this is my feeling on it. Again, I'm not saying that this is they probably were out there to be a functioning band and record and stuff, but in my mind. So I like to think of what Doyle and Jerry did next musically as sort of like it was a guitar refining band. No, that's the wrong word. It was like a what do you call it? Like an incubator. It was like a think tank. It was essentially a practice run of what they would end up doing with the Misfits name. It was like God, what is the word I'm thinking of? You know what I'm talking about when you like a workshop. It's like they were workshopping their guitars with this band. They basically, under the tutelage of George Germain, they learned how to make instruments, and then took it to the next level by bringing that into the machine shop and machine shopping their own versions of the knockoff Iceman and Rickenbacker. They were like, forget these templates that we already had. Let's make our own original designs. And of course, you've heard the story of how Doyle had been drawing his design since he was a little kid on the construction paper that would wrap his textbooks. His mom would wrap all of our moms did, or some of our moms did, would wrap the textbook with the who's a was. Sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here. And they made these guitars, man. They made these. There's the Annihilator, which is Doyle's guitar is the Annihilator, and Jerry's guitar is the Devastator. And they put these, when they were in the Misfits, Jerry had the habit of, he would always fix. It started as a keychain. It was like a skull that hung off the head of his Rickenbacker, the tuning forks, and then slowly that skull rescinded upward onto the actual head of the Rickenbacker, and then when he when he started doing the Devastator bass, he made like resin molds, and he would do like latex versions of the head. So I guess they're kind of mushy. They're not hard. Maybe they are different now. I don't know. But he started putting a cyclops skull on there, and I guess that's where they got the name for Cyclopean Music, which is Jerry's publishing company, whatever you want to call it, for music. And so, and then, you know, the pickups, like, I guess there's no knobs on Jerry's guitar, like on his bass guitar. They just sort of he just plugs in and it's just loud. And I'll be honest, I'm not a fan of the way either one of these guitars sound. I don't like their sounds. I don't like the tones. I never was a fan of the tones that were coming out of I like those new Misfits songs. Are very catchy in a metal-y sort of way, but they're metal songs. A lot of those songs, American Psycho songs, carry over from the songs that we're talking about right now. This guitar and songwriting workshop that was affectionately known as Kryst the Conqueror. So Jerry and Doyle formed this band called Kryst the Conqueror, and it's a songwriting workshop and a guitar making workshop for their stuff as they're to keep themselves busy. And they record an album, and they get this guy Jeff Scott DeSoto to he's a metal singer from this other band, which name I cannot pronounce, to sing on it, and he's not credited. And there's I've heard that he was embarrassed, and I've also heard that he was under contract with his band and he could not sing elsewhere, and so he was just a hired vocalist to come in and do the tracks. And some of the tracks are one track is called Attack of the Megamites. But yeah, a lot of that music got recycled for American Psycho, and yeah, it just sounds like metal, man. It's just like, you know, those guys were very influenced by Van Halen, and that album you can hear the metal, and so they never really lost that metal edge in the 90s, from the 80s. They were just very into that sort of thing. And yeah, I'm just not a fan of the tone, not a fan of anything. In any case, this project, this Kryst, and Kryst is spelled with a K instead of a C, and it has a Y. They tried to sort of they saw that Glenn, and I guess it was a direct reaction to what Glenn was doing, apparently. You know, Glenn is going in the Sam Hain and Danzig direction and getting darker and darker, and these guys are on the flip side. They're like, we're going to be the light. Mike Watson says that he has a sealed cassette of Deliver Us from Evil. That's the name of the band. And the drummer on that cassette, on that album, hey, what's going on, Russ? Russell Patterson in the house. Russell also says that Soto did a short stint with Journey. I don't know. Who's Craig Brought? I don't know who you mean, Russell. You got to explain, buddy. But, fuck, what was I just talking about? They did the album, Deliver Us from Evil. They had a deal. You know, they had a deal. Oh, that's what I wanted to say. The drummer, so it was Soto on vocals, Jerry and Doyle on guitar and bass, and then the drummer was the Merp, and the Merp was almost the drummer for Walk Among Us and the Misfits, and then he was all dressed up for a photo shoot, and he decided to get married instead. And yes, as Rue says, during this time, Jerry went by the name Mo the Great, and in the same template as the Fiend Club, they had the Doyle Club, the Doyle Fan Club was their fan club, and because they had learned from what they were doing with the Misfits, you know what I mean? They like figured it out. Like we have to be in touch with our audience, with our base, and so they had all this merch that came out, and it was just a goofy project, and you can. So I have actually seen many, many, many unreleased photos from just a bunch of Kryst stuff, and it's very silly. some outtakes from some photo sessions. So when you see those Jerry and Doyle posters or whatever, some of them, if you only see them torso up, if you look torso down, they're actually in like sweatpants. It's really funny, like green sweatpants. And yeah, the Merp would go on to play for Sardonica, and he would play in some other band, which I won't even name on this podcast because I refuse to acknowledge that existence of that person anymore. And the Merp is a nice guy. I've known the Merp in the past. We've hung out. We jammed one time with Sal singing Astro Zombies. There's video that will never see the light of day because it's so embarrassing. And he's the only dude that has a Kryst the Conqueror tattoo, which you may have seen on the Lodi Facebook page. Go check it out if you haven't. It's it's right there on his forearm, and I took a picture of it. It blew my mind. I was like, this is the only Kryst the Conqueror tattoo in existence. And you know, they almost had record deals, and there's stories of how Jerry like famously walked out of a record deal, record contract, and you know, at somewhere, Clive something, some record contract. Sorry. I'm not used to broadcasting this late at night. However, I did broadcast last night at the same time. I do a Family Matters podcast with my friend Jeremy, and you should check it out. If you're a fan of Family Matters, we're doing deep dives on seasons 1 through 9. That's what I do. I just do deep dives on friggin' obscure minutia, like the Misfits. The Misfits inactive period, or the second half of season 2 of Family Matters. That's fun, though. We came up with some interesting takes. It's interesting to watch that show as an adult, the Family Matters show. But I digress. So, this is a very interesting time to speak to Jerry Only. You know, and he did a bunch of interviews for the band. The band never actually played any shows. You know, God, I'm trying to remember. Craig says, Russ, you need to come up and we can go on another epic pilgrimage. Yeah, I'm assuming that's to Lodi, and that's a fun trip right there, to go on an epic pilgrimage to Lodi and see all the spots and places and things. It's a place of legend, and it's a wonderful town, you know, and I'm sure they're hurting, and you know, so if you're feeling froggy and you're social distancing and covering your mouth with a mask and gloves, go and support the local Lodi Academy. I'm sure they can use it. So they never played out. Kryst the Conqueror never really played out. They didn't do any shows. They recorded this album. They spent years working on it, and nothing ever came of it, because what happened at the same time concurrently is that Jerry started to try and get the Misfits name back, and they got their sights set on it. They didn't want to start all over again, you know. They wanted they wanted the name, and you know, when you think about it, they're starting to see the Misfits become popular. I'll never forget. I think it was Manny Martinez, when I spoke to him, and I asked Manny, I said, Manny, when did you start to realize that the Misfits were getting really big? And the Misfits were already getting really big before they were on Manny's radar. But I think he said sometime in the early 90s, he was walking down the street and he saw some guy wearing a Misfits t-shirt. And just finally it registered with him that this thing that he had, you know, essentially started with Glenn and Jerry had ballooned into this whole underground phenomena. And, yeah, what a trippy thought, though. And so, yeah, the Misfits are getting, and Jerry and Doyle are obviously more aware of the Misfits getting popular in the late 80s than, say, Manny Martinez was. And they're going, well, you know, what the hell, man? Like, we need to, you know, we busted our ass. They did. They worked their asses off for years, you know, and never saw the recognition for it. And now they want some of it. And Glenn's not interested in it anymore. He's moved on. And so they're trying to get the name back. And it's just a shame that they couldn't just call themselves the Resurrected, man. Imagine, I bet you the Resurrected would still be going today. Think about it, like Joy Division and New Order, you know, it just would have been great, you know. Russell says, Jeff, Craig was my cohort on the Lodi trip where we went to Zing's house in like 97, I think, and did some additional interviewing. Very nice to meet you, Craig. And that's really cool. And yes, I think you guys should go on another trip. Who knows? Maybe when this all maybe I'll join you. Maybe when this all blows over, we'll all go together. We'll do an in the field episode. Wouldn't that be fun? Huh? We'll go to Lodi Pizza. We'll go to the graveyard where there was the flood in '82. We'll walk around. We'll go to Cardi's Sugar Bowl. Yeah, we'll go to God, what's that place? The hot dog place, not Ruts Dogs. Jesus, what's the name of that place? The one I'm talking about, the one with the Hank's Franks. Hank's Franks is another great place. So yeah, we'll see. We'll see what happens. Maybe it'll be a year from now. Who knows? Who knows how long we'll be doing the show for? But if things clear up and I feel comfortable coming out of my hovel to go to Lodi, I'll go with you. We'll go meet up with Sal B too. We'll get Sal B on the trip, and he'll show us around as well. We'll go to the old Kayafa compound and look at the gate and the pool house where the Misfits used to practice. Okay, so this has all been warm up, by the way, for the interview that I'm going to be reading. And again, this content's really out there. It's not like rare content. It's just that we're just dissecting it, man, because it's like Saturday night and shit's crazy in the world. And I'd rather be talking about the Misfits than reading any more news. I don't need any more news today. Apolitical, by the way. I'm not talking about politics. I'm just saying the world is fucked in general. The world was fucked back then. The world is fucked now. Sorry, I'm just very pessimistic. I apologize. Let's get that garbage talk out of here. We're here to talk about the Misfits and Jerry Only and Doyle and Glenn and yada yada yada. In any case, so this is an interesting period to talk to Jerry Only, because Jerry Only is like, he's not trying. There's no like revisionist history. There's no like, his viewpoint is different than it would be in the 90s and later on. And, that's not to say that his viewpoint later on is not invalid. It's just that it's different. And it's just interesting. This is like the part of like, historical research, when doing like research on a topic or a thing from a long time ago where like, it's just really, or, I guess maybe even if you're researching for a book, it's like these are the documents and opinions and pieces to pour over, because they're going to be the most unbiased sources for, getting a well-rounded look at the picture. And in this case, what does Jerry think in the year in winter spring of 1990? So at some point they switched drummers. They got a new drummer for Kryst the Conqueror, and that basically evolved into the resurrected 95 New Fits with when they added Michael Graves, whose name was supposed to be Mike Stand, or Jerry wanted his name to be Mike Stand. And I believe it was either, what's his face, Green Man, type Peter Steele, or it was Jim the Tank Dorsey, a.k.a. Jonathan Grimm, who came up with the name Michael Graves, which sounds a lot better than Mike Stand. Sorry, Jerry Only. Coming from a guy who's like, call me Jerry, only Jerry. I'll call you Jerry Only. Or Doyle. Doyle. Doyle's name actually used to be P.C. Doyle. Paul Kayafa Doyle. And then it got shortened to just Doyle, and then Doyle turned into Doyle Wolfgang von Frankenstein. Now, I don't know if that was in for the 95 hits. I think he was still just Doyle. Sorry, my nose is really itchy. I think he was still just Doyle. What is going on? I think he was still just Doyle for Kryst the Conqueror. In any case, they win the lawsuit. They get the name back, and Kryst the Conqueror goes up on a shelf. As a matter of fact, it gets buried. No one ever wants to talk about Kryst the Conqueror ever again. Russ says microphone. Is that for real, Russ, or is that are you just making a joke, or is that actually that was actually the thing? Maybe you would know better than me. Mike Watson says American Psycho would have been a good name. Famous Monsters would have been a great. Oh, Mike, I agree with you fully. Famous Monsters would have been a great name. I don't know how I feel about the American Psycho, but Famous Monsters, boom, there's your name. And everybody knows that that's really just the extension of the original Misfits band. They could have avoided so much backlash. They would have so much more musical legitimacy to what they were doing. And most of all, they would still be compared to the Misfits, but they would never, I don't think you would ever compare Michael Graves to Glenn Danzig. I just don't think you would as often. Yeah, so it is. Yeah, it was Tank. Tank told that to me too, and I think it was Tank who coined it. It was not Peter Steele. Peter Steele was the guy who went to Jerry because Peter Steele was almost gonna sing for the band, and he was like, "You should have this guy sing." Because Mike was teaching Peter Steele the songs, and he's like, Peter Steele just goes, "This guy knows the songs better than me." And although apparently, I guess if you listen to some of those live recordings, Michael Graves is doing a lot of guesswork on some of those vocals. Yeah, it wouldn't have been an issue. They were going to call themselves Them. There's so many names they could have chosen from. It just kills me that it came back as it just shouldn't have been the Misfits. It shouldn't have. I've kept my mouth shut over the years because I'm been in touch with some of those new Misfit guys, and I just out of respect to them. But now that I don't talk to one of them and haven't spoken to the other one in many years, and probably doesn't even remember who I am at this point, I don't really care anymore. But back then I kind of did, especially when I thought I was going to get an interview from the other guy. I did interview Michael Graves for this documentary. He did not know who the Misfits were, but back then he had heard of Danzig, but he hadn't heard of the Misfits. But it still was interesting to get him on camera talking about the original 77 to 83 Misfits. So I got about a half hour of him. I don't know what I'll do with it, but it definitely will go in the documentary somewhere, which was to settle a debt. So that brings us to this interview. So it's the Pit number 3, page 27 to 30, winter of spring of 1989, an interview with Jerry Only, Look Who's Back by Brian Davis. And special shout out to Misfits Central for culling this material. Let's give it a read, shall we? Okay. In 1983, what does that say? Went he now? This is not written right. In 1983, that's what it's. Oh, sorry. The T is okay. Got it. In 1983, when the now legendary Misfits disbanded, so they were legendary in 1989. So this is like 6 years after. The legendary Misfits disbanded, and Glenn Danzig went on to Sam Hain, then solo, but not really solo because Danzig was a band, was an actual band then. Many fans were left to guess the fate of the other members. Almost 6 years later, a plot beyond Plan 9 is soon to be set in motion. Jerry Only and Doyle, the rhythm machine of the Misfits, introduced their new band, Kryst the Conqueror. Now, as Russell said earlier, Jerry Only was not going by Jerry Only. His nickname, I guess, for close personal friends was always Mo, I believe. And so he went by the name Mo the Great. So Mo the Great is actually Jerry Only during Kryst the Conqueror. And they dressed in ridiculous garb. They wore these face masks, and they had these knuckle sort of glove with spikes coming off of them, and capes, and all sorts of ridiculous stuff. And it's funny, Doyle still just had the devil lock. Doyle has always been Doyle. From the age of 16 to, how old is he now? 56, maybe? From the age of 16 to 56, for 50 years, for 40 years. Sorry, my math is terrible. Yeah, for 40 years. For 40 years, since 1980, Doyle has been Doyle through thick and thin. The plot thickens as the Doyle fan club seeks domination With a renewed gathering of members since the Fiend Club days, I had an opportunity to speak with Jerry, whom also goes by the nickname Mo, about these recent developments and old goals. The interview was conducted via mail since time doesn't seem to move fast enough for Mo. I can't keep him on the phone. All answers are relevant as of 12/17/88. So this was a mail-in interview. Russell says, very barbarian-esque. Yes, that's true. That's what they were going for. It's like Kryst the Conqueror. It was like Conan the Barbarian, Kryst the Conqueror. This is interesting. So this was a mail interview, and this is like coming from, again, much like the way that you could call up Glenn in the 80s and just talk to him. Jerry was also very accessible by the phone all the way up to like mid 95, 96. It was very easy to get Jerry on the phone, and Tank talks about like, just getting a phone call from Jerry while he was at dinner. He's eating dinner and all of a sudden Jerry Only calls from him. He's like, this has got to be a joke. This isn't really Jerry Only. So yeah. Back in 83, when the Misfits seemed doomed to disband, did you have a conscious plan to continue under a different name? Jerry Only responds, at first, I planned to join with Dave Vanian after I saw him on tour in England of 1978. What? So what he might be referring to, and again, this is kind of funny because like, this is kind of like what these guys do. Like, they kind of, sometimes when they do interviews, I just feel like it's very like discombobulated, like I understand what he's referring to. So when he saw him on tour in England in 1978, first of all, in 79, the Misfits went over, unless Jerry went over to England in 78 before the Misfits went over in 79. Maybe I'm mistaken, or maybe there's a typo here and that's supposed to be 1979. But the Misfits went over to do a tour with the Damned. They didn't have their contract. There was no contracts. They did it on a verbal agreement that was sort of like not serious in any way, shape, or form. They fly over there. They do a show and a sound check and then get booted off the tour. They claim because they weren't getting paid. They got a manager. It was a whole situation in England. They were bumming around for a month before they flew back to the States with Joey Image leaving first because he was dope sick. But here's the thing. So when Bobby was in the band and Jerry was hanging out with, oh, you know what? I just crossed wires. Wow. Super embarrassment now. I'm thinking of Sid Vicious. What the plan with Sid Vicious was to be in Sid Vicious's backing band. Jerry was hoping on some level that by befriending Sid Vicious, and I heard this from Bobby Steele told me this, and I've heard this elsewhere, that they were going to, that Sid had wanted the Misfits to be his backing band. And literally the moment that Jerry hung out with him like once or twice, and the second time being the night he died. And there's a whole thing on the page about that. In any case, I guess Jerry says, at first, I planned to join with Dave Vanian after I saw him on tour in England in 1970. I'm going to say 79, not 78. This was in the far future, but in 1987, when we first started Kryst the Conqueror, he was the first person I called, although he wanted a spookier sound, so we weren't changing and neither was he. So Jerry claims he called Dave Vanian, and he would repeatedly persist and try and recruit Dave Vanian to sing for the new Misfits, like a ton of times, and Dave Vanian would always decline. But he claims, so here he's claiming in 87, Vanian was the first to be called, and he wanted a spookier sound, and they weren't changing, and neither was he, so they split. The interviewer asks, Brian Davis asks, what spawned the horror rock appearance that you faithfully upheld in your music career? Jerry Only says, since I was young, I was always into dinosaurs and monsters, so I seemed to think along those lines naturally. We found the horror image after Bullet because we were unable to be political. It just wasn't us. The horror image worked. Don't you think so? ? Now, I just want to chime in here. While they didn't think they were being political necessarily, they're still writing, they're still maybe not there's not politics, but they're social conscious songs. Their songs are socially conscious, even if they come from like a antisocial perspective, like I Turned Into a Martian or Horror Business, So while maybe not political, although I guess maybe Violent World could be sort of considered a slightly political, it's elevated. It's elevated beyond the horror thing. The horror thing is on the surface. That's my 2 cents. Brian Davis says, when you see fans buying Misfits bootlegs and original pressings for outrageous amounts of money, how does that make you feel? So even back then in 1989, people are paying out the nose. Not like they are paying out the nose now. I mean, now these records go for thousands and thousands of dollars. A trip to a Cough Cool could fund a trip to Hawaii, But even back then, records were going for lots of money. So yeah, Mike Watson agrees. Not political, but aware. Yeah, that's good. That's a good way to put it, Mike. They're aware, I mean, the song Bullet is kind of a political song, in a little way. Maybe even Who Killed Marilyn, from that angle. That's how they came at that stuff. Even, you may disagree with this, but even Earth AD is political, man. Earth AD is political. It's the politics of survival. I mean, look at the shit we're dealing with. Sorry, don't mean to get political. Look at the shit we're dealing with right now, though. You know what I'm saying? Like, we're living in Earth AD. So Jerry says, it's a shame that our products are mismanaged. The people who are selling this Misfit stuff are just taking advantage of our fans. So here's like a legitimate beef, and I think everything he says there is super valid in that, Glenn doesn't want to do anything with the band name and is sort of like doing his own thing. And, the Jerry's just sitting here going like, all our stuff is going for all this money. Why the fuck should we not be profiting off of it? So when you think about it, even from a fan's perspective, we're going, fuck this using the Misfits for the name for American Psycho and Famous Monsters. But from Jerry's perspective, it's like people are bootlegging my shit or our shit. People are, already ripping us off, and we're just sitting here working at a machine shop. Like, if anybody's going to be using the name and Glenn doesn't want to use the name, then it might as well be us. Let us go out there and put out Famous Monsters and American Psycho. Why the fuck should these fucks be doing it? And you want to know something? On that level, I gotta tell you, I totally friggin' get Jerry Only. I really do. I get it, man. I totally get it. Dude just want it. Dude's like, if everybody else is gonna be making a buck, I should be making a buck too. And on that, you cannot disagree with that. You could say, oh, it's selling out, or oh, he doesn't have respect for the band or the band name. But on any level, you see people making money off of your stuff. Even if Glenn wrote the songs, Jerry has a huge stake of ownership in that band. He was there from the beginning too, and it's just like he was in that band since he was 17 years old. I say that's a valid comment and a great motivator for the lawsuit. How did the Doyle fan club come about, and is it similar to the Fiend Club effort? Jerry Only, he's saying this in 1988 via mail. And why would they be going back and forth in mail unless he just gave him all the questions via mail and he responded in the, I don't know. Mail and interviews. Interesting idea. I mean, I get it, but interesting. Today it would just be done over Facebook Live. Jerry Only says it's the Fiend Club of the 90s. So this interview is from 89, early 89, but he's saying it's the Fiend Club of the 90s. Our product is the best it can be, and we're moving it as cheap as we can. I predict that in 5 years, we will be the biggest fan club of all time. We plan on a color catalog for 89. The Doyle fan club is going to work entirely through mail order and will carry Iron Maiden, Metallica, Kiss, and of course, Misfits merchandise. So Jerry was trying to do like a mail order catalog business with like the Misfits and like Kryst the Conqueror as like, the centerpiece, and, probably having befriended Metallica at some point on some level, probably thought that he would be able to get Metallica merch too. And he says he predicts that in 5 years it will be the biggest fan club of all time. I don't know if it's the biggest fan club of all time, but God damn it, the Misfits Fiend Club came back with a bang in the 90s, and there were a lot of members. Russell, were you a fan? Were you in the Fiend Club in the 90s? And if so, do you remember how big it was? I would imagine it was pretty darn big. So that's what he's predicting in 5 years. In 5 years, he would be back. He would have brought the Misfits back to life, and this would all be, water under the bridge. But at the time, he's thinking about it's going to be a fan club. This is how we're going to make money. So he's thinking about things from he's thinking about he's calling it product. He's calling it product. He's probably referring to merch, because he's seeing bootleg stuff that's not coming officially from the band, that he's not profiting off of. Brian says, tell me about Kryst. How long have you been together? What's the lineup? Jerry Only says, Mo is the bass, Doyle is the guitar, Merp is the drums. Formed August 1987. We didn't have it, so August 1987, so that's almost 4 years after the final show with the Misfits, roughly. We didn't have any songs, but we were in business. Interesting. I spoke with Dave Vaney in The Damned in September. Then I called Merp. He is by far what Doyle and I needed to be solid. We are all great friends. That's what is really important. You see, success is an illusion. Surround yourself with good friends. So also at this time, maybe a little bit earlier, around somewhere in the 80s, Robo is actually living in Vernon as well, I believe. Actually, Vinny, I don't know. Vinny is sometimes I see him on the Facebook page. I don't know if he ever watches these. Vinny is Robo's son. Vinny, when did your dad, if Vinny's listening, Vinny, when did your dad work at Pro Edge? Because he worked at Pro Edge even when they were doing Kryst the Conqueror, but I don't believe he was involved. But yeah, Robo, it's kind of funny to think that the Earth AD lineup minus Glenn was all sort of just still hanging out in the 80s together after everything that had happened. They tried to get Robo back. Robo left, and they got this new guy, Brain Damage, Brian Keats, for two songs from the last show. Now, here's that's like a whole, we're going to dive into that one day. We'll talk about Brian and his point of view and what happened with that. But he got really drunk and he got pulled off the kit, and Todd Swalla from the Necros finished the set, 18 songs. Jerry and Doyle aren't even standing for the show. They're just sitting on their amps playing. It's a miserable show. Glenn announces they're going to break up. But they had dates lined up for Germany. To support Earth AD. It was going to be their first real, official tour across the pond, not including the disaster in England. And because Glenn had cut a deal, and they were going to do, they were putting out Wolf's Blood as the European name for Earth AD. I believe it's the same track lineup. I think that it's just called Wolf's Blood instead of Earth AD. And they needed a drummer, and so Glenn picked this guy because he liked his haircut. This guy, Brian Keats, who's in a lot of punk bands. He was in a ton of stuff, and he's a seasoned drummer too. That's what makes it all the crazier, that he couldn't even cut it for one show. He couldn't hear anything, and he was drunk off his ass. Doyle picked him up by his collar and threw him off. But they were trying to get Robo back, man. And I think they even tried to get Googie back. They were trying to get a drummer. The Misfits could never hold on to a drummer. They got Doyle. They got very solid. They had a stable lineup with the three of them, and they just ate up drummers like crazy. They ate up drummers like Tic Tacs. So the Merp sort of tied them together. Merp is a great drummer. I like Merp a lot. I hope he's doing okay. Merp, I hope you're okay wherever you are, buddy. Brian says, what should Misfits fans expect from the new band lyrically and musically? Mo the Great, a.k.a. Jerry Only, says, musically, we're much tighter than we've ever been. Lyrically, we attack what we once were. We believe that evil should be destroyed. It's that simple. So that's the whole thing about this band. Evil should be destroyed. It's that simple. How strong are the ties between the Misfits image and the overall theme with the new band? Jerry Only says, Kryst is Jerry Only on his home planet. He controls the Soldiers of Light. Wow. The Soldiers of Light. He has evolved from the destructive tendencies of man and has grown into the ultimate warrior. And maybe this is where, Jerry's turning into let's lift weights and work out. They always lifted weights and work out, but this is where he got his squeaky clean sort of for the kids. It's for the kids sort of image sort of situation. Is there an agreement in place for a record? I believe Atlantic was interested in signing a contract. So that was the thing. That's the record label I was referring to. They had a record contract at Atlantic, and Jerry walked out of the meeting and walked away from the contract. I don't know why. Actually, so at this time, they're working with Atlantic. Jerry says, yeah, I'm working with Atlantic. I believe they can accomplish whatever I want if I can work with Jason Flom. That's Atlantic's A&R man. We will iron things out and then take things over. The one thing that I want people who are going to take on this project to know is that we are going to go to war, so it won't be nice. Brian says, you mentioned that there was a comic book in the works to accompany the upcoming album. Briefly summarize the storyline, concept, and plot. So I guess I don't think anything ever came from that comic, but the new Misfits did eventually do a comic book. There were comic book proof. There was a comic book. There were pages done, but nothing ever came of that either. There was, however, a Sam Hain comic that came in the box set. Jerry Only says, everything just seems to be being against Glenn, fighting Glenn, It's a battle between light and dark. It seems a shame, but in the story, war is inevitable. Kryst and his men are forced onto Earth and fight a war over the Earth and the universe. It's strange because the songs were written first. Brian says, outside the band, what other interests take the time out of your day? And Doyle's. Jerry Only says, Doyle and I are manufacturers. That's what we do constantly. We see what we want and we go for it. Our band is on album pace. We put 15 songs together in less than a year. That's about right. So they put 15 songs together in a year. Many bands. So when you think about it, actually, if this is at the tail end of 88 and they started things in 87, really they put an album together in the year of 88. That's interesting. So I always thought that Kryst had been going on earlier, but I guess not. It started in 87. Many bands that break away from the underground scene feel they need to justify their efforts as a musical progression. What are your thoughts on the subject of selling out? Is it just a matter of opinion? Jerry Only says, we will not sell out. We never did, and we never will. I write exactly what I want. Always did, always will. I don't have anything in common with any musician I've ever met. Selling out don't compute. Brian says, what advice would you give the young underground bands about survival in the alternative music scene? Jerry Only says, just don't be a bunch of assholes. I found very few people who wouldn't fuck you over if they had the chance. I guess I'm blessed with Doyle and Merp. We don't have to take anybody's shit. We don't need it. And then here, of course, the final question, something, I can't say that French saying. What is it? The piece de resistance, whatever that is. I sort of tried to cinch it just now. I know you guys are no longer friends with Glenn Danzig, although he spells it Glenn Danzing, to put it mildly. But what do you think of his solo debut? So Glenn had just put out Danzig 1 because it's 88. You know, Glenn is like poised to, you know, take over the world with Danzig, you know, or not take it over, but like, just onslaught with Danzig. Jerry Only says, Danzig has a good band. I think some of the tunes are too slow, but that's just my opinion. I've only listened to the tape twice. I guess I'm just better at telling you what I'm doing. So that's the interview, and it just, I don't know, I just think that gives like a very interesting, and there are more of those interviews, especially when you get into the 90s. That's where he really starts, because right now he's trying to push the Kryst the Conqueror, but once he like buries Kryst the Conqueror and tries to go back to like being the Misfits, that's when he really starts to say interesting things. But I thought that would be, you know, maybe we'll do another one of those on another day and really sort of, you know, read into what's going on with Jerry.